I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico.
And I'm Dean Detloff.
All right, folks, to say the very least, it has been a tough few weeks. We've been really struggling to think up a really good way to, I think, do justice to all of the ongoing political struggles and situations, as well as kind of do an episode that people would enjoy listening to. And it's all very hard. Of course, we're talking about the police murder of Dante Wright and also the recent release of the video of the police murder of the 13-year-old Adam Toledo in Chicago, which is all just kind of too much. It's a lot to sit with. It's a lot to process. Thinking through the explicit and awful injustices of those situations is just kind of paralyzing. And I don't know, what do you even do? What do you even do when you face those types of injustices in the world? Something that's really, I don't know, Dean, maybe we can kind of just say a few words about it here. I heard about the news earlier today about Adam Toledo. We're recording this on the 15th, if that's any if that's any orienting date. But Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, made some comments in a New York Times article that she just wants people in the city to stay calm. And to me, that is beyond belief. I have no idea how you could possibly stay calm in this kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's a bizarre thing to say. I think because it's also totally ineffectual, I guess. I feel like the last thing you want to say to really calm people down when they're rightly pissed off that 13-year-olds are getting shot is to just tell them to chill out. I feel like the only way you'd really calm people down is if you were like, listen, I'm the mayor and I have political power and I'm going to wield that in a way that makes sense, that stops this from happening. Telling people to be calm is not the way to do it. It kind of reminds me of, even people like Martin Luther King and lots of others who are, of course, they would prefer people not to riot. It's always the famous sort of line that the riot is the language of the unheard. And, calls to be calm, I think, are coming from the mayor for obvious reasons in that political situation, but they're going to come from all kinds of Christians, and Christians have really bad ways of thinking about politics and unrest, and especially ways of thinking about people being shot and other people getting pissed about that. And
yeah,
I don't know. It's a tough thing to know that you're just going to get frustrated a lot in the next few days.
Yeah, totally. To me, it just seems like such a gross thing to ask people to do, or just a statement to make, because what you're asking is just for people to not do anything in the face of something that's awfully unjust, right? It just seems like the craziest thing to say to some people who are obviously going to be upset. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's a bad thing to say. Maybe she shouldn't have said that.
Yeah.
Well, in light of all that, we're kind of trying to get through, process some of these big feelings we have, and figure out maybe what to say about it, or what kind of comes through, when we're thinking critically as leftists and Christians about this whole thing. And if you follow us on Twitter, you'll know that one of the ideas we've been really sitting with and thinking through a lot throughout Lent and now through Easter is, where is crucifixion happening today? This is a sentiment that we've been borrowing from Lydia Wiley Kellerman and all the other folks at G's Magazine, who just published a really timely issue on the idea of resurrection. I mean, crucifixion and resurrection, these are ideas that kind of go together, but the crucifixion part, I think, is so much easier to identify as a political way of thinking than resurrection is. It's not much of a stretch at all to map the police murder of these two young black men onto the idea of crucifixion, or to map on the idea of people in COVID onto the idea of crucifixion. I think that all makes a lot of sense to do that, and I mean, I think a lot of people have been doing that throughout the pandemic or throughout the last summer's uprisings around Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and stuff. So the difficult part, though, comes with Easter having just passed. Now there are even more big tensions to think about. Where, I mean, for Christians, we can't just think about crucifixion. We have to think about what comes next, the, the resurrection, which is, um, admittedly, for me right now, a very hard thing to think about when I'm very mad. um, it's just I think maybe a tense, some kind of tension that's in there. Crucifixion is an easy thing to look for and find in the world, but resurrection is a little bit difficult, especially when things are particularly bleak. So in this episode, I thought it might be a good idea to stretch our brains and our emotional capacities, and kind of like Lydia has said, instead of looking for where we see crucifixion in the world, we're going to talk about where we might see resurrection happening.
Yeah, I think it's important to think that through. I want to preface this by saying I've always kind of struggled with resurrection language in the middle of political discussions because, like you said, crucifixion is easy to tie politics and theology together, right? It's a person getting killed by the state. Resurrection often feels very ethereal or kind of otherworldly, or it's one of those like supernatural bits of Christianity that is maybe important in your imaginative life and your spiritual life, but can be hard to create, or doesn't more naturally lend itself to creating some material relationships.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard too for me to be thinking about resurrection in light of these murders and just in a world that's kind of surrounded by death right now. I feel in the middle of a pandemic. But at the same time, I mean, I've been spending a lot of time in the last several months reading liberation theologians talking about things like resurrection. And I don't know, I think it's maybe an important moment to also be reflecting on what would it mean to think about resurrection in a way that's materially efficacious and gets us not past the crucifixion at all, but allows us to translate some of our understandable and reasonable rage at those kinds of injustices into some other way of living together after that.
And luckily for us, a lot of other people have actually done some of the legwork for us. So it's not like we're out here philosophizing anew or whatever. We're gonna pull from a lot of folks in this episode who have a lot of good things to say about the ideas of resurrection, redemption, renewal, and what those things might mean materially. So yeah, just a big overview, I guess. The point of this episode, as always, is to definitely avoid theology outright because we aren't theologians and we aren't good at it, but instead to think about a theological concept or idea like the idea of resurrection through a more Marxist lens, and see what it has to tell us about our own politics or the way we should think about politics. So maybe just to get us started, Dean, we can start with the person we've been talking about the most so far, Lydia Wiley Kellerman, who was on the show not too long ago. So go back and listen to the episode we did with her about her new book, The Sandbox Revolution. But I'm going to read an excerpt here from the essay she uses to introduce the new issue of G's about resurrection. The essay is called "Do I Believe in the Resurrection?" Again by Lydia Wiley Kellerman. Do I actually believe in the true reality of the resurrection? Did Jesus come back to life? I don't know. Does it matter? What I do know is that I would stake my life on it. I believe in mystery and wonder. I believe that systems of murder and oppression do not have the final word. I believe in life and compost and the seedling lingering under the snow. I believe that resurrection is something we practice with our lives. I think this is such a good place to start because, I mean, first of all, Lydia is a very wise person. She's very smart and a very good writer. But I think that what she does is helps us maybe take a step back from some of the, like you were mentioning earlier, Dean, the more like ethereal and otherworldly parts of the idea of resurrection. I don't know. Growing up in a very evangelical house, resurrection was something that was like triumphant. Easter Sunday was like this huge, weird party. Not a great party that you want to be at, but it was one for sure. But when Lydia's talking about it, it's something different, right? Does it mean that Jesus actually comes back to life? I don't know. just like she says. But there's some kind of logic there really worth investing in. And that's really important to, I think, being a Christian, but also just, I mean, apart from that, there's maybe some bigger political ideas happening too. Believing that systems of murder and oppression don't have the final word is a type of hope that I think is a good one to practice. I'm always very skeptical, I think, of optimism, but I think that as a fundamental belief is a really important one for Christians on the left. Being a complete pessimist and thinking that, yeah, I don't know, the systems of oppression will just continue to ravage our communities and people until we all die is not an idea that I think can survive if we think about resurrection in a political way.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think too, what I love about this piece from Lydia as well is it always is drawing us back into what would it mean to practice resurrection in our lives, not to just see it as this thing that's very far off and left to our theological imagination, but something that you might be able to think about in your daily life or in an organizing meeting or something like that. And I think that even trying to build the bridges between that theological imagination and that material activity is such a challenge. It's hard, I think, too, because resurrection often becomes an excuse for like putting off hope for redemption into the future
Yeah.
or coming up with cheap hope or something like that. I think Lydia is really trying to force us not to do that, right? That compost is the resurrection, or seedlings under the snow, that's the resurrection. And I don't know, maybe this is a good way to bring in another voice and we can put them together a little bit. So I contributed to that issue with an essay on Bolivia. And when I was writing it, I was thinking, what am I supposed to say about resurrection? I'm not very good at doing theology, etc. So I went to the people that are, the liberation theologians in particular, and I found this great essay by Ignacio Ellacuria, who was a Jesuit in El Salvador who was murdered by U.S.-trained right-wing paramilitaries. He has this essay called The Crucified People, and what I love about it in general is it's really trying to not say that we should empty out the crucifixion and the resurrection of their kind of theological meaning, but on the contrary, that we should really force that theological meaning into the material world and sort of see what happens, or interpret that materiality through it. So I'll read just a little excerpt from it and we can keep pulling this out a little. He says, the crucified people has a twofold thrust. It is the victim of the sin of the world, and it is also the bearer of the world's salvation. But this second aspect is not what we are developing in terms of the Pauline died for our sins and rose for our justification. A stage focused on the resurrection of the people should indicate how the one crucified for the sins of the world can, by rising, contribute to the world's salvation. Salvation does not come through the mere fact of crucifixion and death. Only a people that lives because it has risen from the death inflicted on it can save the world. The world of oppression is not willing to tolerate this. As happened with Jesus, it is determined to reject the cornerstone for the building of history. It is determined to build history out of power and domination, that is, out of the continual denial of the vast majority of oppressed humankind. The stone that the builders rejected became the cornerstone, stumbling block, and rock of scandal. And he goes on to sort of tie that Christological imagery to what it means to be a people in history. I think there's a lot to kind of clear up in some of this language. Maybe we can do that together. But what I really like about it, just on the face of it, is it really drives home that idea that salvation for Ellacuria is not this kind of one-time event that Jesus accomplishes on the cross by solving a metaphysical equation, but it's actually a lived reality that all of history is invited to participate in, and it privileges the people who are being crucified as people. So it kind of expands our horizon of thinking about resurrection to start thinking about what would it mean for people to rise up and reject the death that's inflicted on those people every day.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I always struggle about with theology is I mean, I'm sure it has more to do with the way my brain maybe processes some of this just because of my underlying systems of knowledge or whatever, but it does seem otherworldly even when Ella Curia is writing about
Yeah.
it. But I mean, when you kind of dig in though, I mean, what it means is actively acting against those regimes of death, right? It means like it means finding ways to make sure the crucified people are are resurrected, I guess, but not just in like the spiritual sense, but in a more political sense. I think that's a pretty powerful idea that can help us maybe stave off, or at least me, me alone, stave off some of this otherworldly thinking. It's not pie in the sky. It's like resurrection is what we're doing when we're fighting against the systems that will inevitably kill people, ruin communities, and destroy lives.
Hmm. Yeah, I think too, there's something about Elikuria's understanding of salvation that's really important as well. So I agree. Not being a theologian, I sort of struggle to make this matter in a certain sense. But in the broader context of the essay, Elikuria also says what's fascinating about his idea of like Jesus and salvation is that he doesn't have this kind of view of we all have our legal trouble with God, and Jesus has to die to get us out of that legal sentence or something. It's rather that we're stuck in we're burdened by systems of oppression, and we have to be saved from them. But what's great is, again, Elikuria doesn't want to leave that in kind of the single event of Christ's death, but he wants that to be a thing that moves history in a particular direction. And I like it too, because you might come away from this with the impression that Elikuria is putting the burden of salvation on the oppressed, which is a very bad thing to do, right? To sort of fetishize the oppressed as the people who will save you or save everybody else. On the contrary, I think what he's saying is, if there's ever going to be any kind of salvation, it will only come by virtue of the people who are the most oppressed having the kind of agency to get out of that situation. And I think that's a challenging word and an important one to hear when, the whole world is operating on a global economy of death, but also when we're seeing the oppression of people in real time, like on the internet, on Twitter, scrolling through, seeing it on TV. It's important to kind of think through, what does it mean to think about salvation in light of the people who are being actively crucified every day?
Yeah, I think so too. One line that sticks out to me from this, the reading from Elikuria, I'll read it again. I mean, I know you've done it, but I don't know. I'm going to repeat it. It's my podcast. I can do what I want. Elikuria, this is the part that sticks out to me. Salvation does not come through the mere fact of crucifixion and death. Only a people that lives because it has risen from death inflicted on it can save the world. I mean, kind of what you were saying. I guess I'm thinking back to like that. I don't know, man. Maybe like a month or so ago, there's like this wild Twitter discourse about whether or not Jesus had to die or something.
Right.
And and for some reason, like that's what's echoing in my brain as I'm reading this. And I guess what's important is like that theological conversation is completely nonsensical if you think about salvation in this different way. If it's not about whether or not Jesus dies or has to die, or if God makes Jesus die, or some kind of like weird 12-dimensional chess of Christian theology, but it's instead about the fact that people live on after that death or find ways to come back after that death. It's not about like the metaphysics, I guess, in this way of thinking, but it's about the struggle that stems from resisting those regimes of death, whether they're just capitalism outright, or police shooting people in the street or whatever. It's about the struggle that comes after death, that's like where the salvation comes from, I suppose.
It really kind of reminds me of that really classic Gramsci line, the pessimism of the intellect. Sorry, the pessimism of the intellect, the optimism of the will.
Yeah.
The pessimism of the intellect is basically knowing that the world is crucifying people all the time. But the optimism of the will is I guess that sort of hope of resurrection, that just because everybody's getting crucified or specific people are being crucified and oppressed, that doesn't mean that you can't work to try to change and abolish that system of oppression. And I think that is like such an extremely hard thing to hold on to. And I want to be clear too, it's like very important to say that if you don't feel that way, it's fine. like sometimes it just feels very bad and totally helpless. And I think people on the left, and Christians in particular, need to be able to understand and metabolize that affect. But it's also, the promise of resurrection in this kind of liberation theology trajectory is that resurrection means that people get out from under the thumb of oppression. It doesn't mean some kind of, future oriented event that you'll figure out when you do finally die yourself. It's this is a horizon that we're working toward right now because that's what it means to believe in it or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's true. Just a minute ago, you said doesn't mean it's a future-oriented event, like an eschatological event. But I do think that there is something that we can say about time and salvation that might be important, especially in this register. One of the metaphors that Lydia uses is the seedling under the snow, and there's a I think that is actually kind of maybe an important way to think about it too. That it's not just like crucifixion and then resurrection. Like, I mean, like, listen, Jesus did in 3 days. That's great, great for Jesus. But I mean, maybe for the rest of us, we need some more time. Like,
Mhm.
resistance takes time, and like the metabolizing of death takes time. Like, understanding what it might mean for us takes time. And yeah, laying in wait under the snow though is it's to me it's such a good metaphor because it does reference that, like, that resurrection moment. It might take time for a community to process something, or it might take time for us to come to terms with an idea, or to even know what to do or how to act or whatever. I guess, like, in the Christian narrative of Easter, you get like this immediate resurrection, and I don't know, it doesn't work. It doesn't work like that when it comes to the societal, the societal level. You need time to put down the roots, or for the snow to melt, or whatever the added bit of the metaphor is.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's right. And I think it is important to keep it that way. I guess I meant it's not futurological in the sense that it's like a future that never comes.
Right.
It's not like the Left Behind situation or like dispensationalism where one day you'll just get like raptured up there and you're just kind of waiting around for it to happen. But it's like it's the kind of thing that, yeah, like it comes in its own time, but it comes sort of on this plane in that respect in an important way. Like I said, I'm not a theologian, so it probably comes on other planes too, like in some other theological way or whatever. But I leave that to theologians to figure out. I think for me, again, pulling back to the Lydia rhetoric too, what does it mean to kind of practice resurrection with your life? In a world dominated by oppression, it means that you have to be working toward some kind of way of getting rid of that oppression, making resurrection happen, making it happen sooner than later, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, well, when we were kind of writing some notes up for this episode, we were kind of trying to gather the threads, like who are people who help us politically think about the idea of resurrection. And we got Elakiria, a theologian. We've got Lydia, a very good and smart person who writes this great magazine that we love. And I think that's all very philosophical enough. But it wouldn't be a Magnificast episode with Dean and I only if we didn't mention Walter Benjamin. We do it all the time, and we're going to do it right now. There is a theme in Benjamin's philosophy of history, um, about this what Benjamin calls like a weak messianic power, and I think that it's a different spin on redemption. It's a different take, and it's interesting just the same. So I guess how about this? I'll read this thing, Dean, and then you can tell me what it means.
Yeah, sure, sure. That sounds easy enough with Walter Benjamin.
Yeah, cool. Um, great. So I'll just kind of jump in here, and then you'll be the one to elaborate on it.
Yeah, right, right.
I'm the student in your class reading it, and you're the teacher. All right. Walter Benjamin says this: Our image of happiness is indissolubly bound up with the image of redemption. The same applies to our view of the past, which is the concern of history. The past carries with it a temporal index by which it is referenced to our redemption. There is a secret agreement between past generations and the present one. Our coming was expected on earth. Like every generation that preceded us, we have been endowed with a weak messianic power, a power to which the past has a claim. This claim cannot be settled so cheaply. Historical materialists are aware of that. Okay, hang on. I was gonna tell you you can explain it, but this this passage from the philosophy of history, this is the second thesis. If you're reading along, if you heard me say Benjamin and you went to your bookshelf and pulled it off the shelf,
Yeah,
and
you
like
paused the
flipped through,
podcast
that's what,
to make sure that you got your scriptures and you have a bookmark.
that's right. Man, there's so many things to say about Benjamin, but he is. I mean, his just great prose. It's fantastic. I love it. The secret agreement between past generations, the present one, is a great turn. I love that phrase. All right, Dean. So lay it out for me, man. Just to let me know what he's talking about here.
Yeah, Benjamin is always a good person to think with, especially because nobody ever knows what he really means. So you can say whatever you want. Nobody can tell you that you're wrong. I think at least what I've always appreciated about Benjamin is he has this way of being attentive to transgenerational struggle, or kind of the long horizon of struggle. And I think that is also an important piece in talking about resurrection. I want to preface this by saying, so Walter Benjamin, if you don't know who he is, he's a German Jewish philosopher, very important guy, a Marxist thinker. And I don't want to like Christianize Benjamin. I think people do that a lot.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
so
that's fair.
Listen, I'm not saying that Benjamin believes in the resurrection in a Christian way, and I don't want him to. But as a Christian myself, thinking about it, I think what Benjamin helps me to do is to continue to materialize that belief in redemption, that kind of, eschatological vision that one day all things will be well and the lion will lay down with the lamb and all the boots for war will be burned in a fire, etc. I think for Benjamin, like there's a similar sort of messianic vision of that peaceful moment, but to get there, you have to really attend to the not so peaceful, the struggle that's happening right now on this plane in order to arrive at that space. And I think for me that comes out especially well when he has that bit about the secret agreement between past generations and the present one, that our coming is expected on the earth. There's something that really speaks to me about resurrection in that context, right? It's like, on the one hand, there's this chain of history that's drawing us toward that eschatological vision. It's this dream that's kind of shared, a dream of liberation. There's also a way in which the people who've passed on, who have died, they have their own kind of repetition in our own life or in our own consciousness, that they experience a certain vicarious resurrection through our own efforts to take on that torch and keep running with it. And yeah, so many evocative phrases in Benjamin that I think can help us think about things like resurrection and redemption specifically.
Yeah, for sure. One more of those evocative phrases is the phrase "weak messianic power."
Yeah.
I think that's less so as a religious idea. I mean, it's he's using that religious language, but I think this is a really helpful idea if you are a Marxist. Listen, if you read Marx, the revolution's coming so quick. You could blink and you'll miss it, right? It could happen now or soon, right? Like the contradictions of capital from Marx are they're too much, and the socialist revolution's right around the corner. As soon as the bourgeoisie get overturned, right? That's gonna happen. But the thing the thing about Marx is that it's not quite so simple. It doesn't happen very fast. It doesn't seem inevitable as some readings of Marx might suggest. And I guess the reason I like the phrase "weak messianic power" is that it does suggest that like there is a potential for the redemption of people through real struggle, that like things could turn out better than they are.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a weak power. It's not for sure. It doesn't come like it's not here right now because it has to be. It's just like it could be on the horizon and you're never really sure. And man, it makes me think back to well, okay, so Richard Gilman Opolsky has a book about revolution and communism, and he uses this phrase he kind of comes up with himself called precarious communism. And the phrase is I don't know whether or not it's good branding. That's somebody else can decide that. But what I think is really helpful in his writing is that revolutions and like uprisings, they either happen or they don't, and like predicting them is very difficult, and you can't really do it. And anyways, all of that to say, I like this way of putting it though, that there's a weak messianic power in every generation, that like maybe it will work out to something better than right now. Maybe there is some redemption on the horizon, but you're never sure.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, as you're saying that, it just makes me think too that there's something important about allowing the material expression of resurrection, the side of eternity, to be sort of fragilized.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe there's a guarantee at the end, fingers crossed, if the church is right, there's a guarantee at the end that everybody resurrects into their perfect, beautiful spherical bodies and everybody's enjoying their life. But until we get there, practicing resurrection is precarious, and it is this kind of thing that's not guaranteed. I think this is different too from the postmodern theological stuff about fragilization, right? Like, there's a lot of stuff in theologians like John Caputo or these other kind of deconstruction theologians where they'll talk about, the God who may be, or a God who's insistent and not existent, and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know, that stuff's fine, I guess, if you're into that sort of thing. But to me, I feel like it all depends on how you fragilize something like the resurrection, or something like the hope that God represents. And I think the way that Marxists do it, or the way that someone like Benjamin does it, or even the way Elicuria does it, is to say, well, the resurrection happens insofar as we can build the collective power to get there. Like, it's not because, it's not fragilized because of epistemological issues, or because of, something that Derrida said, as much as I love Jacques Derrida. But it's fragilized because, like, life is extremely hard, and building that movement is incredibly difficult, and you're basically up against, like, everything else. And how we fragilize that, I think, makes a big difference.
Yeah, totally. I am not a person that likes to poke fun at postmodern movements in philosophy or theology.
Same.
Because I think it's largely it's things that I think are really important and that I like generally. But I mean, I don't know. It's hard not to see the glaring distinctions that you can make between the the fragilization of winning political power, or winning a slightly more just world, and like the weakness of God, or whatever. Maybe God exists, or maybe God doesn't, and like, whoa, isn't that interesting? And like, I mean, postmodern theology is fine, but I'm much more interested in the question of justice than I am about the existence of God. I don't really care that much, I guess.
Yeah, or justice,
In the end.
justice insofar as envisioned by Benjamin's like wild Marxist eschatology, rather than justice as envisioned by, a conference, a conference with a bunch of theologians.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that sounds right. Cool. Well, let's not talk about postmodern theology anymore. Let's talk about something more interesting.
Yeah.
Dean, let me tell you about folk music for a minute.
Okay, sure.
Man, that's a great transition. I nailed it there. All right. So one other way, like I mentioned earlier, we were kind of gathering these threads together, and of course we've got Lydia, we've got Walter Benjamin, but also what about labor songs? What about folk music? That was like the first thing that came to my mind when I think we started talking about resurrection as a type of political idea. I mean, there's an overarching theme within labor songs in the United States, like the wobbly songs or other types of union songs, about movements memorializing their martyrs. And it's a huge theme. You can find it all up and down every labor song. But the one that does it the best, and the one that I think is most interesting in the way that it does it, is the song "I Dreamt I Saw Joe Hill." You're probably familiar with the song. If not, we'll play it at the end of the episode. If you put "I Dreamt I Saw Joe Hill" into Spotify, you'll come up with about 1,000 different versions of the song. And I'm going to tell you right now, save yourself some trouble and heartache and listen to the Paul Robeson version, because that's the best one, and everyone knows this. It's beyond dispute. No one's going to argue with me.
I'm not. That's
but
for
yeah,
sure.
there we go. For sure, yeah. The Joan Baez one's good too. The Pete Seeger one, it could be better if it was recorded better, but the Paul Robeson one's the one you want to go with. The man has a beautiful voice, and the song is like extremely moving and stirring. Anyways, if you don't know, Joe Hill was an old timey union guy, basically. We could get into there's a lot more history, that there's like real history that does exist about this person, who was sort of like a musician in the early labor movement in the United States. He was a Swedish immigrant. He was in Salt Lake City organizing and involved with the labor movement. And he wrongly was accused of killing a cop, and they ended up like shooting him for it. And like it was like a state execution. But anyways, the song "I Dreamt I Saw Joe Hill Last Night" is so fascinating, because it's like it's the remembrance of a person who is important to the labor movement, someone who put their life on the line for it. It's the the resurrection by way of remembrance. But even more than that, I guess like the memorialization thing is there, but I think it's even more than that in this Joe Hill song. Um, like I said, we'll play at the end of the episode, but some of the language used in the song is really important. So the first part of the song kind of just tells the story of Joe Hill, and it's this kind of interesting back and forth. So on the one hand, it's a person recollecting, I saw Joe Hill die. The cops shot him. But Joe Hill is there in this person's dream as like a ghost or whatever. I mean, he's not dead. That's what he keeps saying over and over. Joe Hill doesn't die. But the next part I actually do want to read. This is sort of like in the narrative of the song. It's Joe Hill in your dream telling you these things, and these are the lyrics. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, as Joe, what they can never kill, went on to organize. That's it, right? And I think what's so fascinating about the song of Joe Hill and this like kind of way of thinking about labor and organizing and politics and martyrdom too, that's a big part of it, right? Is that the death of a person within a movement is important, and it's remembered not in the sense of just like, man, remember that person that did a cool thing that did so much for us or whatever, but it's like that person's spirit lives on in a really important way in a sense that they've never died. That you couldn't kill them if you even tried, I guess is it. The ending of the song is from San Diego up to Maine and every mine and mill where working men defend their rights, there you'll find Joe Hill, right? This extremely Christological Christological Joe Hill, wherever two or three are gathered in the workshop organizing a union, that's where you find this dude. And it's really a fascinating theme that I think crops up in, I mean, not just the labor movement, I think in other types of uh, you know, general like maybe leftist movements or other types of political movements too, where people don't die. They are always kind of present in spirit in this way that precedes though their like just their memory.
Yeah, Joe Hill's one, I think, very cool and very important historical example, right? Somebody whose life lives on in so many radical ways. But I think too, even the movements that we're seeing right now are reflective of that, right? Like George Floyd died, and it's important to say that like he is gone in an irrevocable way, like in a way that demands people mourn and face up to that reality. But George Floyd also lives on in people who are saying, we can't breathe. It's not just George Floyd who can't breathe. And I think seeing, it's important again to not overinflate this. Like, I think, saying George Floyd is resurrected in a political movement is an important political statement, but you don't want to paper over the fact that he also is, killed by the state. But there's this way in which even when the state kills people who are oppressed, especially, they can't really like completely obliterate those lives. They can't really throw them into
Right.
a hole from which they never come out, because there is this kind of spirit of liberation that stirs over all that kind of injustice and does kind of resurrect those people so that they do have more words to say, whether it's in other people's mouths or in the streets in different bodies. And I think, I don't know, there's something challenging about that. I don't know exactly how to talk about it in a way that feels totally adequate or appropriate or accountable, but I think there's something intuitively there where, at least like if I'm thinking about the resurrection, those are the touchstones that make it make sense. The execution of someone like Joe Hill, which spurs the industrial workers of the world to go on strike, in the woods in California or something, or the death of someone like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, or all these people, unfortunately, that the names have to kind of continually be added, but in the adding, in the remembering of those names, they're expressed in a material way. I think there's something really profound about that.
It's also worth drawing out too, like in an attempt again not to paper over everything or come off as tone deaf in some way, that like I mean anti-black racism is a lot different than anti-union sentiment or something.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, of course.
It's worth saying that like um they're not like completely analogous situations. I guess what I'm trying to draw out is a similar movement in like the way people remember, but like um Joe Hill is a union organizer who's like actively um like trying to start a union and like do all this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And like, I mean, George Floyd is a guy
Yeah.
driving his car, and like, that's a whole that's like completely fucked up in a different way. I
Absolutely,
guess is what I'm
absolutely.
trying to
Yes,
say.
1000%.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's important not to conscript people into politics when they're just executed for trying to live their life.
Yeah, like, not saying that, like, any person, any black person who is, like, the victim of police violence or whatever would not be, like, invested in politics or whatever, but just, like, yeah, exactly, not conscripting people when maybe that wasn't even the situation, so something to be upfront about.
Yeah. Well, let's dig ourselves out of that hole because we're obviously not the people to sort that out. I will make a good transition, though. I think that feels natural. James Cone. I've been reading a lot of him in the last year or so as well, and I think one thing that I am impressed by in Cone's work is this ability to force Christian theological categories to make sense of situations of oppression and specifically anti-Black oppression in the United States, to try to make those theological doctrines express or confront that reality. And for Cone too, a lot of people talk about crucifixion with Cone, and that makes sense, right? His last most popular book was The Cross and the Lynching Tree. There's a lot of time that he spends on the crucifixion. But he also understood resurrection as a political liberation. And I think that is, again, just an important thing to keep thinking about theologically, where it's like, it's not to say that you should fetishize, again, oppressed people as the ultimate vehicle of everyone's salvation, but rather to say there is no liberation, there is no material resurrection without the most oppressed people being able to live a free life. That's what resurrection means. And I don't know. Again, I wish I was good at theology, because I'm sure there's probably a lot of ways in which that would make a lot more sense to me, but there's something there that is really compelling.
Well, there's one more thread we can kinda tie up here with this conversation. So, thinking through resurrection as politics, one thing we're thinking about that I guess was ringing pretty clear for us too is that there's also resurrection in the sense of attending to, building a society after a struggle, after a revolutionary situation. Again, listen, we said Walter Benjamin, we've got him on the board here, but also Ernesto Cardinal is the person that comes to mind, and the situation of the Sandinistas, just like, I guess, one of our one of our many interests on this podcast. But within Cardinal's poetry, I mean, being a previous priest, being a person who was like actively involved in the Nicaraguan Revolution, and then after in like being deeply involved in the sort of I don't know, the reformation of the state. I mean, like ousting Somoza, and building a whole new society that is different. He's writing this poetry and kind of thinking of resurrection in that work that he's doing, not just as a poet, but I think also as like a political figure as well. So there's a few different places that the themes of resurrection come out in Cardinal's poetry. One of them is sort of minor, but very interesting, I think. So if you're a longtime listener of the show, Ernesto Cardinal also wrote this other book called "The Gospel in Solentiname," where basically it's a transcription of conversations he was having with farmers on this little island, this like archipelago of islands in Nicaragua. And it's really fascinating because it's just like him talking, and they're talking about the gospel, they're talking about who Mary is, they're talking about the political situation. Lots of like interesting stuff in there. If you want to read what like Nicaraguan farmers thought about communism and the Bible, this is the book for you. It's really fun. But anyways, what's really fascinating is that through Cardinal's writing and his poetry, and then even through the writing of other journalists who were writing about Nicaragua, you can kind of track some of these figures that start in Solentiname, and like I mean, like they go and they take part in the revolution themselves, and they're like active. Two of the figures that are present early on in the earlier writings from Cardinal are these people, Donald and Elvis. They're both figures, I think, that are in the Gospel in Solentiname. And I think in Penny Leno's book, Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution. Is that right, Dean? Is that what's called?
Sorry, it's actually Margaret Randall's book, Christians in the Nicaraguan Revolution.
Thank you. Jeez. All right. So in Margaret Randall's book,
Penny Larnell's
anyways,
also a cool journalist. There's a lot of very good ones, but yeah, that one's Margaret Randall.
Sorry, I'm just reaching from the top of my head and I forgot the name of the person. Anyways, you can see all I'm trying to say here is that you can track the trajectory of these folks that start in Gospel and Soltaname and go into these into Cardinal's poetry. But it's man, I don't know, it's such a weird experience being very far removed from that situation and then reading about all these people. It is kind of heartbreaking in a lot of ways to read what they're writing early on, and then you see them eulogized in Cardinal's poetry when they die. So I guess I just kind of want to read this quick excerpt from a poem that Cardinal wrote called "To Donald and Elvis." It's just a really small bit, but the preceding bits of kind of reminiscing about talking to them about the gospel in Soltaname, actually. So Cardinal goes on to write, "When I saw the disinterred bones of the two of you, I remembered you, Donald, in Soltaname Mass saying that the resurrection was not skeletons coming out of tombs, but the survival in the consciousness of others." Um, I think that's such an interesting. So it's really this is like Ernesto Cardinal's style, right? It's like sort of this documentary poem. He's just saying what happened. He's remembering a thing, but it's such an interesting performance of what he's talking about. He's saying that I remember that in Sultaname you were saying that the resurrection wasn't skeletons; it's about people remembering you, and that's like something that Donald said. But it's also something that Cardinal is actively doing in the poem, in this sort of like performing the documentary poem of this guy's life, and such a fascinating thing to do after someone who, I mean, obviously you have a pretty strong tie to, passes in this wild revolutionary situation.
Yeah, I think so. It's really neat to read it in that context too, or instructive, because so there's resurrection happening on that one level, right? That Donald is being remembered, and like you said, there's this kind of performative way in which he's being resurrected through just the writing of the poem. But the idea too is that Donald and Elvis both died in the struggle for the resurrection of the Nicaraguan people. And you see that so often in Cardinal. There's a certain sense of survivor's guilt, I think, in a lot of Cardinal's poetry. But you also get this sense that these people gave their lives so that other people could live in a truly free way. And that sort of double piece of resurrection, that these people are being resurrected in the consciousness of Cardinal, but they're also being resurrected in the process of building a revolutionary Nicaragua. There's something about that too that I think really helps us draw out that materiality of resurrection, and maybe brings us back to that fragility piece too, right? That resurrection only happens insofar as we bother to try to remember and bother to try to continue to sort of build a world where crucifixion doesn't have the last word.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. All right, do you want to read this other Cardinal poem here?
Yeah, there's a number of places where resurrection comes up in Cardinal. Here's one. This is from a poem called Oracle over Managua in a book called 0 Hour, but it shows up in some other collections too. I'll read it a bit and then contextualize it. But he says, "Revolution is a function of evolution itself, because evolution has a frightening velocity. From a stick came light. We enter into the Easter of the revolution." And Cardinal has this like really fascinating cosmology. Like he's really into thinking about atoms and cells coming together and science, and kind of putting that together with his theology and his politics all in the same moment. And you get that in these lines. It's kind of all there. The idea is that revolution is a function of evolution itself, because evolution for Cardinal is this really wild experience of things kind of coming together and changing and transforming and mutating, and trying to sort of put a political and theological gloss on that science, I think, is so fascinating. So there's this way in which resurrection pushes us into a different political reality, but it also puts us into a different sort of cosmological understanding too, right? That it draws us into an understanding of our place, in the biggest possible sense, our place in the universe, in our political worlds, in our personal worlds. Resurrection has this really expansive meaning in Cardinal's poetry that I think is a good way that we can draw connections to all kinds of other things, anywhere that people are being oppressed, or we're trying to sort out the material reality of these otherwise speculative ideas.
Yeah, I think that's good. Cardinal, what a guy! A lot going on in this poetry.
Yeah, no kidding. I'll bring us to a final thing that we can get on the Magnificast board here, Matt. As we move to the end, and this is a quote from the German Ideology by Karl Marx.
Oh wow. Okay.
Engels is in there too, but let's be honest, this is probably a Marx one. Marx is a way sexier writer than Engels, and I think you get it here for sure. So, I think it's hard to think about resurrection in a materialist way, but I do think that there are kind of resonances in the Marxist tradition that also point us to other political struggles. And I always think of this line in the German Ideology. So Marx says, Marx says, we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. And I think that idea, we could sort of substitute resurrection for communism there as well, that we call resurrection the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. I think, trying to think about like all the unrest that's going on right now, and trying to plot resurrection within that, I guess I sort of want to make sense of resurrection as the abolition of death in the Christian tradition, and thereby also the abolition of things that cause death, right? The abolition of police, the abolition of systemic racism, the abolition of labor exploitation, all these different things. There's this place where resurrection and communism come together in that negative movement. They both point to a positive future with all kinds of things that you can say about them. I think that's important. It's not purely negative, but in the immediate sense, the hope of the resurrection is that all this very, very bad stuff can actually be dismantled and be abolished.
Yeah, I think that's a cool way of putting it, honestly. It does make me think back to, talking about communism and love with Richard Gilman-Lepolsky as well. There's sort of like a similar logic, I think, between those things, right? Resurrection is about the redemption of people, putting your life kind of up there for folks. And communism is about practicing that type of love too, that abolishes the things that would cause other people death. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good way of thinking. It is a type of thinking that I think Christians are not are not good at right now. I
Yeah.
mean, thinking about like Jesus and resurrection is sort of like an Easter Sunday, a cool moment where you have a sunrise service and you eat the Easter eggs afterwards. That's great. But thinking about what resurrection might mean materially is something that Christians are very bad at.
Mhm.
That it might mean the abolition of death, and it might mean the abolition of things that cause death is a tough one probably. But I think that if Christians are committed to seeing crucifixion in the world, if that's something that we can do, I think that seeing resurrection in the world is probably something we can do as well.
Yeah, and seeing it as something we have to sort of work toward, something we have to achieve, so that, again, crucifixion isn't the last part of that story. That's a huge piece. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. You can find us on Twitter at The Magnificast. You can email us at themagnificast@gmail.com. Our music is by Amoria Armstrong, and our outro this time around is by Paul Robeson.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake City, Joe, says I, him standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than guns to kill a man, says Joe. I didn't die, says Joe. I didn't die. and standing there as big as life, and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill, went on to organize, went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where workers strike and organize, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he.